Awesome. Welcome for joining us for this information session. We're really happy and excited to be sharing and announcing the second cohort of our Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Changemakers Program. In short, we call it the CMP program. So you might see us say this sometimes once in a while. So with that, we'll just get started. We wanted to share a little bit about ourselves, and then we'll talk a little bit about Metamorphosis as an organization, as a platform. So I'll start with myself first. I'm Pooja Shahani. I use she, her pronouns. And I started my career as a journalist and then moved on to the development sector and then did some consultancy work. And lo and behold, suddenly found myself in the diversity and equity space around 12, 13 years ago. I don't even know how long ago. And I started actually as a consultant, kind of learning how companies were doing this work from an external point of view. And after a while, I sort of felt a little bit like a hypocrite because I'd never worked in the corporate sector before. And here I was advising corporates. And so I decided I'd join the corporate sector and see what it's really like. So I joined Goldman Sachs here in Bangalore in 2015 and just got a sense of what it's really like to do things internally. What are some of the barriers? We think DEI is quite I'd say natural and easy to do, but in fact, I think it's one of the most difficult things to really embed in any organization. And so after that, I decided, okay, it's time for me to step out again and see how do we really turn DEI into something that's sustainable, something that's deeply embedded in an organization rather than something that's just ad hoc. And this is when Aarti and I kind of got together and started to have many conversations, which eventually led to this. So over to you, Aarti.
Thanks so much, Pooja. And it's a pleasure really to be launching this second cohort with Pooja. I'll tell you a little bit about myself before we talk about Metamorphosis and this program. I'm a work psychologist by training, and that means my whole career I've had the pleasure of applying psychology to the workplace. So started out building assessments for hiring, did some leadership assessment, leadership development, and then in 2012, I got my first formal job in the diversity and inclusion space, as it was called then. This was with Catalyst India, doing a lot of gender diversity work. So India-focused research and consulting, workshops, roundtables for our members in the region around especially how to make it workplaces inclusive for women specifically. Did that for 2-3 years. And then I left to do my own thing. So I was an independent consultant until very recently. And just last week, actually, I joined a consulting firm called YSC as their DEI solutions consultant. So along the way, at some point, I started rebranding myself as a DEI consultant, much like I think Pooja did and a lot of us did. And yeah, so we'll tell you a little bit more today and also in the program about why that adding the E was so important to both of us. And yes, Sushmita, there is something called work psychology. It's also sometimes called occupational psychology, business psychology. My degree actually says industrial organizational psychology, which is a mouthful. So I just say work psychologist. Thank you for asking that. A little bit about Metamorphosis and how we launched this platform. It's actually a baby of the pandemic. So last year in 2020, in March or April, when everything, life as we knew it, sort of changed, which seems like forever, Pooja and I got together and decided that now is a very critical time for society as a whole and organizations to rethink inclusion, rethink the way we work, what employee experiences can be like, and how we can embed equity and empathy into all these experiences. So we launched a series of conversations. A lot of the work we did initially was pro bono, which turned into some client projects. And of course, a year later, we were able to launch the first cohort of the Changemakers Program in April this year. And that was a wonderful success. It was a long 12-week program. So the one we're going to be talking about today is a streamlined version of that, but we wanted to go in with a big bang. We had experts from various different countries. We had participants from different countries. We had a really enjoyable time bringing it to everyone and wanted to replicate some of that magic in future cohorts. So I'll just say that and hand it back to Pooja. Or am I continuing for a bit? Yes, I will continue for a bit. Okay, so I think that does bring us to the program we're talking about today. So in November, we're going to launch this second cohort of the Changemakers program. And as I mentioned, it'll be a streamlined version, which means it'll be 6 weeks, all online. But what we wouldn't be changing is this core approach. So we do believe very strongly in a multi-pronged approach, which means it's not just about sharing knowledge or frameworks or theories, but it's also a very practical, very self-reflective, approach. As I mentioned, empathy and vulnerability are very important values that we bring into the work we do. So it'll be multi-pronged in the way the methodology we use. The other way I think we want to differentiate this program from others is its focus on both systems level issues, systemic change, as well as looking inward. So looking outward as macro as we can, and also looking inward into our own personal perspectives and philosophies around DEI. So ideally, in terms of the audience, the participants, we would assume those who benefit the most are those beginning their journeys in the DEI space. They may or may not have actually held roles in organizations. We had a couple of people who were working in the nonprofit sector who also really benefited from it. We had folks working in corporate, even folks that led D&I for their organization, and they still benefited. But ideally, folks that are looking for a more structured and elaborate, I guess, comprehensive approach to the DEI space. And in terms of what you'll be learning, of course, we have this long list. You can look at this at leisure. What I will point out are a few, I think, key things that, again, differentiate this program from others. And of course, Pooja, if you want to add anything that I'm missing, please do. One key thing, I think, is the last one here, actually. And we were reminded of the power of this piece just a few days ago when our first cohort got together again, just for an informal sort of meetup virtually. And we realized the power of this network we've been creating. This community has been in touch. They've been supporting each other. Even in the call, we saw a couple of exchanges around how they might support each other, how they might support us, we might support them. So this network is pretty important, I think, as an outcome. The other couple of pieces I'll mention are the skills pieces, right? So a lot of the DEI work is not just conceptual, but it involves building relationships with stakeholders across the organization. It involves communications, influencing, making the case for change. So we'll be doing a lot of that in depth with opportunities for practice, role plays, and different methodologies like I was mentioning. So storytelling and practice is very key also to the way we approach our sessions. What else? And of course, I mentioned the personal commitment piece is pretty important. I would pick on these three. Pooja, any others that you would want to elaborate on?
Just one quick thing, that there's something that you will probably not learn so much about, which is many times when people come for programs like this, they're looking for best practice examples. Like, what are some companies doing out there? What are some things that companies are doing when it comes to gender and people with disabilities and LGBTQ professionals? And this program is not designed in a way for us to actually share in depth what are some of those sort of best practices or better practices, as we like to call it. But really, our program is based on questioning the fundamental ways in which diversity, equity, and inclusion is approached in organizations, in institutions. And so it's very fundamental and systemic in the way that we're doing this. if you're looking for that kind of sort of program, then this might not necessarily meet your expectations if that's the ask. So that's one thing you may not learn, which I think is important to share.
And we will not be coming in and telling you how to solve your problems. We'll equip you with how to do that, but we will not be able to do that for you.
Awesome. So let's go through the modules and just some basics. So the program will start on 10th November 2021. It's a Wednesday. And you will see that the timings are in the afternoon between 3 and 4:30 p.m. And the reason why we actually chose this timing is because our last cohort was timed in the evening in India, which meant that it was quite late for people in Asia as well as Australia. And so we decided this time we would start a little earlier so that it's more friendly for people in Asia as well as Australia. And hopefully we'll be able to get them to be a part of this program, unlike last year. So basically two days a week for 6 weeks, 90 minutes each. And yeah, I think that's the ballpark of how much time you'll be looking for over the course of the 6 weeks. Looking into the very specific modules. So the first module, which is the first week really, is going to be us just introducing the program to you, some expectations, because it is our aim is to build a certain sense of community. So we will spend some time doing that in the beginning, along with sharing some really key foundational concepts of the program, including some key definitions so that we're all on the same page of what DEI really mean to us as a group, and sort of start from there. The second week goes a little bit into sort of the more, what I like to call the very fundamental, beneath the ground sort of concepts that drive diversity, equity, and inclusion. And for us, that's really some things around power, privilege, systems of oppression. And we will be looking into that in the second week and going a little bit deeper. Some of it will be a personal exploration during the session, and some of it will really be about the framework and the theory behind some of the work in this space. Next, week 3, we'll start, now that we've gone into the foundationals, we are all on the same page of what some of this means and why it matters to us as DEI practitioners and professionals. We're going to sort of turn the view and look at the organization. And for us, this is really a 2-part approach, I think, and you'll see this. Week 3 is really around aspects of why inclusive leadership, some of the theory behind inclusive leadership, allyship, psychological safety. Why are these so key, so critical aspects to how organizations can start to create inclusive and equitable spaces in specific. And that's what we start with. And then we'll move into a little bit more about really DEI as how do we really embed it within the organization? What are some of the policies, practices in place? What are some of the questions that we need to ask to ensure that we're looking at DEI from that lens of equity rather than ad hoc approaching certain groups sort of approach that we have so far been doing in the DEI space. This piece will also include a chunk on influencing, because part of DEI roles in general, a big part without us really knowing, is influencing stakeholders, influencing key decision makers. And so we're going to spend some time doing this, bringing in some experts who can talk about how they've been able to do this in their own journeys. Week 5 goes a little bit into the skill sets, the competencies, which Arti spoke about earlier, as well as sort of measuring DEI as in terms of right now, we've been very focused on how to measure DEI efforts. So we're going to go a little bit deeper into what it means to measure DEI, not just from an effort point of view, but overall organizationally. What are some of the things that people can do that may be different? How do you look at data from a different point of view rather than what we've been looking at right now? And accountability, because we feel like this is really important. Actually, it's not that we feel, I think we truly believe that accountability in this space is not just for organizations in terms of how they're being accountable, but also DEI practitioners. What does it mean for us as practitioners to be accountable to this work that we're doing? And finally, week 6 will be all about the final capstone presentations, and I'll share a little bit more about that in the next slide. But this is how the 6 weeks look like, quite packed. In the middle, you will get some reading material, you'll get some tools. We do use Google Classroom as a form of engagement, so there's going to be a lot of engagement on Google Classroom throughout the 6 weeks as well. So I will move on to the next one, Capstone Projects. So what this really means is we really want participants to have this opportunity to apply some of the things that we're talking about in the program into their own lives. So it could be things like you are seeing something that's happening internally in an organization. Now that you're going through this course, what are some of the ways in which you'd like to look at this particular challenge in a different viewpoint? It could be done in a PowerPoint presentation, in a paper, however you'd like to do that. But to keep it rather a lot about something's happening in my real life, how do I use these concepts to approach this challenge, this opportunity that I have in front of me? And so we've given some examples. These are just some examples. You can go, there are actually lots of very creative ways to think about this, but some examples for instance, could be examining your organization's current recruiting strategy and looking at it from the lens of equity. So we've talked a lot about systems, we've talked a lot about equity in the course. Now, if I look at the strategy that I have, what's missing? What are some of the gaps? What are some of the opportunity? Can I just look at it from a very sort of theoretical approach? You don't need to actually start work in that, but it's just this idea of looking at it through that lens. Another example, for instance, could be identifying gaps in just measurement. You know, right now we always look at measurement from how many people did X, how many people were promoted to this, how many women were, you know, that's how we tend to measure. So if now in this learning process, you have the opportunity to look at measurement in a different point of view, how would that look like? And finally, another sort of example that we came up with is what are some creative ways in which you can communicate DEI and the narrative of DEI. So for example, while talking about things like power, privilege, systems of oppression can be quite large, if I wanted to find a creative way to create some exercises and engagement around those topics, what could that look like? So these are some very different examples of what a project could look like for our participants. Now, throughout this, you won't be doing this alone. Aarti and I will be with you as you sort of start to frame the idea in your mind and taking it to the eventual point of view. So you will have one-on-one coaching with us at least 3 times before you get to the presentation stage. Okay, in terms of commitment, this is what it looks like. We're looking for around 25 hours of engagement during the 6 weeks, 4 hours a week. We expect around at least 1 hour of self-learning, like reading the material that we'll be sharing with you, that we've really customized based on a lot of our own reading that we've done over the course of the year. The rates are in front of you on the screen as well. So you'll see these are the rates. There's an early bird rate that's applicable till October 14th, and then a regular rate till October 31st, which is the last day of application. We do have a needs-based sort of scholarship, of which you can find information on that on the website. So you can apply for that too if you feel like that's something that you would require. And finally, this is why you should sign up. So I'm just going to leave it up there for you to look at. But yeah, I would say one of the things that we've learned is there's a power in a space where one can feel brave to share some of the very challenging things in the DEI space. And we were quite lucky in our first cohort to experience that firsthand, you know, how to really challenge some of the ways in which we're thinking and to sometimes put ourselves in very uncomfortable positions. And what better way to do that than a group of individuals who are thinking about this and really engaging in this dialogue from that space. So with that, last thing, application ends on October 31st. So I am going to stop sharing now. And we can also stop the recording now. And we'll go into Q&A later. So I'll just stop.